This meeting is now being recorded. This webinar is a project supported by grant numbers 2017-CI-FX-K001 and 2019-CI-FX-K003, awarded by the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, Office of Justice Programs, U.S. Department of Justice. Points of view, findings, opinions, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this presentation are those of the authors and do not necessarily represent the official position or policies of the U.S. Department of Justice. Hello everyone, I'm Laura Buff, the Grant Program Coordinator for the National Children's Advocacy Center and host of today's webinar. Thank you for joining us for today's presentation entitled Ask the Experts, Professional Resiliency in 2020. What do we know and what do we need to know? Before we get started, I want to review a few housekeeping items with you and let you know how you can participate in today's session. The webinar room contains several windows or pods. The chat pod, located on the right side of the virtual room, is used for questions and comments. If you have any questions at any time, please enter them into the chat pod and hit enter, and your questions will be addressed as time allows during the discussion. Chat size can be adjusted to your liking. If you are viewing this webinar as a group, please let us know by typing into the chat pod the number of participants in the room with you and what state you're from. Recommended resources and other files referenced during our presentation today will be available for download at the end of the presentation. Our moderator today is Karen Hangartner, a licensed master social worker and the project director for the Southern Regional Children's Advocacy Center at the National Children's Advocacy Center. I'd now like to turn the webinar over to Karen.
With, I think we're all familiar enough with video conferencing now that we may experience some technical difficulties. We already have kind of preparing for this, so we're just going to roll with the flow, right? I am Karen Hangartner, and I'm the project director for the Southern Regional Children's Advocacy Center, which is a training and technical assistance center, and we're based out of Huntsville, Alabama at the National Children's Advocacy Center. And so we're really glad that everyone's here and making time for this webinar today. So the last time I did a webinar with Françoise, I kind of forgot to introduce her, partly because I just kind of assumed everybody knew her. But I am going to read the bios today so that you guys know who these fabulous presenters are, and I've been looking forward to this conversation for a month now, so I'm as excited about this webinar, maybe more excited than anybody. But we have Ginny Sprang with us, Dr. Ginny Sprang, who's a professor at the College of Medicine, Department of Psychiatry at the University of Kentucky. Director, okay, here's what's really interesting about Ginny. Yes, I am going to insert my opinions about you guys in here. Ginny has like 15 billion things going on at the same time. So Ginny is the director of the UK Center on Trauma in Children. She just got a Category 2 grant from SAMHSA through the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. She's going to be doing a Secondary Traumatic Stress Innovations and Solutions Center, which I think all of us on the call are very excited to see what comes out of that. She's the Chair Emeritus of the Secondary Traumatic Stress Collaborative Work Group through NCTSN. She's worked and investigated child trauma, commercial sexual exploitation of minors, implementation and sustainability, disaster response and secondary traumatic stress, and she really has done so much work around creating translational tools and the development of testing and implementation of evidence-based treatments. So I'm a big admirer of Ginny, and I think sometimes what we say about Ginny is that she's got this big old brain that we can be talking for 30 minutes about something, and then Ginny just encapsulates all of it in one sentence. So really glad that you're here today, Ginny. And then we have Françoise Mathieu, who I assume everybody in the CAC world knows. She's the Executive Director of Pend Academy, whose aim is to offer consulting and training to professionals on topics related to secondary trauma, compassion fatigue, burnout, self-care, wellness, and organizational health. She's a registered psychotherapist and a subject matter expert on topics related to compassion fatigue and secondary trauma. Before becoming a specialist on stress and trauma, Françoise worked at a mental health provider doing crisis management and employee support to military personnel, law enforcement, 911 communicators, and other community mental health professionals in need of psychological support. Françoise has done a ton of work in the CAC world. She's presented at just so many state and national conferences associated with the CAC world in North America, North Carolina, Ohio, Oregon, California. She's been the keynote speaker at our International Symposium on Child Abuse here in Huntsville. And then she's also worked with the LAPD Homicide, LAPD Human Trafficking Task Force, the Edmonton Police Major Crimes Unit, Cleveland PD, the District Attorney's Offices, Boulder County, and the Chief Coroner's Office of Ontario, paramedic services, and many similar organizations. It's always interesting to hear from Françoise because she is working with so many different disciplines in this work. Françoise is one of the founding members of the Secondary Traumatic Stress Consortium and the author of the Compassion Fatigue Workbook, which is always something I recommend. And she's a prolific writer as well, and has wrote several articles and publications and a TEDx talk entitled The Edge of Compassion. And for the record, at the end of this, we do have a resource list that's going to contain resources that we've kind of put together, and so you'll have connection to a lot of the things that that all three of these ladies have been working on. And then that brings us to Cambria Rose Walsh. And part of the reason I saved you for last, Cambria, is because Cambria's just left her position at the Chadwick Center and is working as a consultant. And she's working on projects with both Ginny and Françoise. So Cambria is an LCSW. She has been working in the field of child abuse and trauma for over 20 years. She's a consultant and trainer in the areas of STS, trauma-informed systems, child trauma treatment, child abuse, child welfare, domestic violence. She's currently consulting with Ginny on the Secondary Traumatic Stress Innovations and Solutions Centers at UK, where she's developing a training module for resource parents on secondary traumatic stress and helping develop resources related to secondary trauma for supervisors and those working in trauma-exposed workplaces, which, by the way, is going to be an excellent project coming out of this, because I do feel like that support for supervisors continues to kind of be a black hole for all of us. So we're excited to follow the work that you guys are going to be doing around that. She's also a consultant with NCTSN, leading the development and implementation of a training for trainers on the Child Welfare Trauma Training Toolkit, which again is available on NCTSN's website. Everybody should take a look at that. In addition, she's an associate for Pend Academy, currently focusing on developing a training series on compassionate leadership. She's one of the founding members of the International Secondary Traumatic Stress Consortium, as are all four of us, actually, and has presented on the topic of secondary traumatic stress at lots of conferences across the country. Cambria did previously work for the Chadwick Center, and she worked and headed up some of NCTSN grants around the child welfare trauma-informed policies, programs, and practices, and also the California Evidence-Based Clearinghouse for Child Welfare, which I think is been just a valuable resource, and I know one that we often go back to look at, you know, which of the programs that are out there, how are they rated in the California Evidence-Based Clearinghouse. And she oversaw the Chadwick Trauma-Informed Systems Dissemination and Implementation Project, focusing on implementing trauma-informed practices in 5 different child welfare jurisdictions across the United States. So as you can see, these women have just a ton of experience in this field, and I have been looking forward to this because we do like to kind of get together and geek out on information about what's going on in the field, and this is a prime opportunity for us to have some conversations around that today and kind of what's going on with COVID and all of that. I am going to invite you to go ahead and put questions you might have for these ladies into the chat box, and we will be answering those questions along the way. So feel free, if you've got a question, go ahead and put them in there for us. But we're going to kind of start with kind of what are we all seeing happening across the country. I know what we're seeing now, 8-9 months into the pandemic, is we're seeing a lot of disruption on our multidisciplinary teams. Folks that kind of at the beginning of the pandemic, when everything went virtual, people were kind of more engaged and things were great. And the longer this has gone on, it's like things are continuing to become just more disruptive. And also, I don't know what you guys see across the rest of the country, but in the CAC world, we see such a broad difference in how different organizations are handling this, opening or closing or partially opened. And so it kind of feels like the longer this is going on, folks tend to be really suffering under the weight of all that's happening right now. So how about if I start with Ginny and tell us a little bit kind of what you're seeing in the work that you've been doing recently.
Thank you, Karen. I just want to check that everybody can hear me okay. Give me a thumbs up if you can. Okay, great. So we actually just launched a project where we're delivering a Project Echo on stress and resiliency in times of COVID. So we had a chance to do a little needs assessment. So kind of hot off the press, I have a lot of feedback that people have given us. And, you know, some of the things that people are noting, and this is a kind of what I call transdisciplinary audience. So they're healthcare, child advocacy centers, schools, child welfare, behavioral health, a nice mix of people. They're talking about real worries around employment stability, threats of furloughs, layoffs, budget cuts. If you're in healthcare, there's the redeployment threat that's always looming, that maybe my job is going to get moved somewhere else and I'm going to have to start doing something like screening people for COVID that maybe I don't feel qualified to do. Working under staff shortages, coworkers who are calling in sick because they have COVID or they're worried about having COVID, or because they have no child care, or they're trying to maintain this non-traditional instruction at home, and so they're having lots of difficulties, so there's some staff shortages. Moral distress, people watching patients die alone, going through very difficult procedures alone, spending the worst days of their life without the, the benefit of the people that they love around them. A lot of loss and loss reminders. So kind of a new thing that's happened is that people are starting to say, hey, somebody at my organization has died of COVID, or one of their family members have, or there's somebody that's very sick. And this is triggering loss and loss reminders in people. There's the threat that maybe this is going to happen to me, which is undermining psychological safety. And then I think the last thing that I hear, and I know I've certainly experienced this just the overall stress of delivering services using telemedicine platforms, which require a lot of technical coaching. And that's not our number one thing, right? Maybe we don't feel like that's in our toolkit of skills that we have, but we're in, I have, clinicians here at my center, they're having to coach families through how to use this technology, and they're used to just delivering psychotherapy services. So it's a real shift in roles, and it makes everything a little more difficult and a lot more time consuming.
Yes, I think you're exactly right. And as we were struggling with some technology issues right before this, it kind of is like that adrenaline surge that, oh my gosh, we can't get this to work. Yeah. Cambria, what about you? I know I'm fascinated around some of the work that you and Françoise are going to be doing around compassionate leadership. So kind of what are you seeing across the country as you do your work? I can't hear you, Cambria.
Thing that we all have to remember to unmute ourselves, right? So I think Ginny did a really nice job, kind of giving some nice overview of what we're seeing happening, and I can echo a lot of what she said. I think, in the work that I'm doing, one of the interesting things that I'm really noting is that life is going on despite the pandemic, and so things that would have normally people would have had happening that were difficult in any kind of time period are still happening. And yet it's got this overlay of the pandemic, and what does that mean for folks? So things like, people having health issues that are not COVID related and having to navigate how to get, the health care that they need, and what does that look like? And safety issues around that as, folks are navigating that. Challenges with childcare that may have already kind of been there and then are exasperated by what's happening. So a lot of these, types of things I think that were already in place that people are then just feeling like this tips the scales and how do I handle this? And I think we're also seeing because of the waves of this, I mean, clearly right now we can say we're in the surge again, right? The cases are going up. And so people kind of got to the point where they felt like, okay, I know what's happening, and this is how we're working, and this is what we're doing, and this is how I'm living my life, and then suddenly, oh, no, wait a minute, everything's changed again. Great example of that is what we're seeing happening in New York right now with the schools there that just went online again, right? So people had gotten used to, this is my child care situation, this is what my schedule is going to look like, this is what my child's schedule is going to look like, and overnight that changes. And then you're back to kind of trying to figure out, okay, how do I manage this? So a lot of kind of quick change pieces that are happening for folks we're certainly seeing. And I think all of that ties into the compassionate leadership part of things, because what we're really realizing is that while we're all experiencing this pandemic, like it's definitely a very shared experience that we are all touched by in many different ways, but how we experience it is very different. I like to use the metaphor that we're all on this sea that changes constantly, right? So some days things are pretty smooth sailing and you're like, I'm in a calm part of the ocean, and then other days you feel like there's huge waves and you're trying to ride those and figure it out. But we're also all in very different boats on this sea, right? So there's some people who are in these luxury liners and they feel like, okay, I've got what I need, and I've got my food, and I've got supplies, and I've got maybe family on that boat with me, and then other people who are in situations where they're feeling very isolated, so they still might be in a very nice boat, but their boat is very lonely, right? And then folks who are navigating this in boats that are leaky or they're not, very well kept, that might be really overcrowded, right? So we're all in very different situations kind of riding through the same piece together. And in terms of compassionate leadership, you really have to look at what's going on for the individuals that I'm leading, and how do I navigate that? And we've seen, leaders really try to take a lot of different tacks with that, and we're kind of learning in the moment. I think a great example, and Françoise and I talked about this previously with each other, was about Facebook and how they came together and said, we really want to support working parents, and they went and created policies and support for working parents, and then all of the people who didn't have children and who weren't facing child care issues were like, but what about us? Now we're shouldering all these extra things to help the people who have kids, and you didn't think about what this is like for us and how isolated I feel or what my mental health is like right now. And so there's this sense of resentment then that starts happening between people. And I've heard this very clearly in groups that I've worked with where they've talked about, well, why does this person get this treatment and this person has this treatment? And so it's really important as a leader to be able to look at those pieces and figure out not only how do you lead compassionately, but how do you create this culture of compassion within your workplace where people are able to kind of step into other people's shoes a little bit, have some empathy and some compassion for what's going on in other people's lives, and look at how to collaboratively work together and kind of solve some of these challenges that are going on. So I think there's a lot of work to be done at the leadership level with that, and then just how we interact with each other in terms of our coworkers.
Oh, we could talk for an hour on that, but I want to I have like 15 questions related to that, Cambria. But Françoise, let's hear from you first about kind of what you're seeing.
Well, first of all, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
You can hear me?
Yeah, a little delay between your sound and your video,
everybody.
but we'll take it because we can hear you.
Okay. I'll try not to make grand gestures then. I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm very excited to be able to contribute. But I also was quite happy to sit back and enjoy listening to the three of you because it's wonderful, and so far I'm just in agreement with everything that's been said. So if I can add to these elements, and I kind of want to tie into some things that Ginny mentioned and then Cambria. In terms of moral distress, so as Karen, you mentioned, I've been working with a lot of CACs across the nation, and there was some really immediate moral distress also in terms of technology and funding. And, recently I was speaking to someone in Tennessee who said that her clients only have a limited data plan, and so they had to choose between having a counseling session or their kids getting virtual education, right? Like really fundamental moral distress around the incredible systemic inequities and barriers that we have. I also wanted to add some elements about what we're noticing in terms of physiology and psychology. So I think we can all agree there's really significant wear and tear. And as one of you mentioned, we're not all zen in February and then this happened. Like we're all already have been working together since 2015, and it wasn't like we had to invent a whole new reality in March, correct? And so we're really seeing wear and tear. And we're seeing wear and tear everywhere. We're seeing wear and tear in leadership, and Cambria and I have the privilege of connecting and talking regularly about how depleted leaders are. And those of you who are familiar with our colleague, Dr. Patricia Fisher's work, she always talked about how leaders are often the most stressed out individuals in organizations. And if I can give a really quick example, one of the things we've been doing is working with long-term care facility directors. So these are directors of nursing homes, complex care. And as you can all imagine, I don't even have words for what they're going through right now. Class action lawsuits for, places where there's been outbreaks, and it's incredible. And so one of the things we're seeing is that leaders are so exhausted. This is almost the 9th month of this, right? So we're really seeing wear and tear. We're seeing an erosion, I'm not going to say civility, but an erosion where everyone's on thinner, our wicks are shorter, and so we're finding that we're more reactive. We have less patience with one another at home or at work. And we're, of course, seeing wear and tear in service providers as well. And the final piece I wanted to mention in terms of psychology is this notion that some of you are familiar with called risk habituation. And risk habituation is a very normal psychological phenomena where if we are exposed to a kind of a threat on a regular basis, but it actually doesn't objectify it, it doesn't actually present itself. Let's pretend you don't know anyone who's had COVID, that we lower our guard. And I had a very concrete example of that last night, and this is a personal story, but I think a lot of people will be able to relate to this, where we may have a different level of hypervigilance or concern about the virus. And so I have friends who are on every end of from the beginning, both ends of the continuum, if that makes sense. And if I'm interacting with someone who's not at the same level as me, I find that exhausting, having to have like, hey, come for dinner. And I'm like, well, actually, and then, they might be like, oh, come on, like all of these negotiating Thanksgiving. And although those may seem small in comparison to the pain and suffering of the children we serve, it's really wearing. And I'm finding that a lot of people, I should disclose I'm Canadian, so we're very, very polite, and we like to not antagonize. And this is actually really stressing out my Canadian friends, is having to have difficult conversations about things that used to be actually a source of joy and rest. Does that make sense?
Oh, it makes perfect sense. Yeah. So we do have a couple of questions coming up. One of them goes back to, Ginny, what you were talking about. Connie asked, I feel it's important to communicate about loss and the loss, it's important, but how do we do this without re-triggering others? It feels like it's impossible.
Right. So I think, first of all, Connie, you're exactly right. It is important to communicate and process your feelings about that. And there's lots of different ways to do that. You know, there are sometimes people will put together accountability partners. So it's a person that they can, a peer that they can process things with, like a loss or a particularly bad day when you've seen a lot of things that are hard to shake off. There's also, you know, more things you do in solitude, like journaling or, you know, some your own cognitive processing where you deliberately, you know, stop and say, you know, what do I think about this? How do I feel about it? What is going on in my body right now? You know, that's a skill and an option we have. But I think, you know, the one thing that we talk a lot about, and Françoise wrote about this in her Compassion Fatigue workbook, is just doing that in a way that we're not impacting others. We're not re-triggering others. So Françoise talks about low-impact debriefing. We talk about it as low-impact processing. But that's really just understanding that you have something to say, and it's really not important to share the graphic details, but that it's what's behind that experience that you really need to talk about. So it's like being self-aware. It's kind of giving fair warning. It's asking for consent. Is it okay if we talk about this right now? And then to only share what is really at the core of what you need to talk about. So nobody wants to hear the graphic details of the death or the loss or the abuse or whatever it is that happened. What we really want to talk about as human beings is what's at the soul, what's in our soul, and how are we suffering, and what is the existential meaning of this event in our life. How does it feel to live in a world where things are happening like this to children, or where things are so uncertain, and any of us, you know, could be struck with COVID at any time? That's what we want to talk about. We want to talk about the meaning behind it. And so I think those kinds of conversations, if they're done correctly, can really benefit people and are really consistent with who we are relationally as human beings and our need to connect and process with one another. We just want to be careful how we do it. So I really, Connie, would suggest, if you don't know it, to check out the Low Impact Debriefing Protocol on the TEND Academy website.
That's great. Françoise, Cambria, do you have anything to add to that?
Said.
Cambria, do you want to go?
Okay, good. Because I want to build off that a little bit, guys. I had a conversation with somebody this week, and she had been working at a CAC in a role, and I remember we had had a conversation a couple of years ago about what could they be doing as part of their organization to be more supportive for their staff. And she devised several ideas, took them up to her supervisor, who said, if we start talking about this, everybody's going to have it. And not only that, but the supervisor has been working in, you know, a CAC for a number of years, who was a fantastic, you know, employee, and this person had a ton of respect for her. But she says, you know, I've been doing this work for 15 years and I'm not impacted by it. So I'm not sure how widespread this is. But I've heard that before, that folks don't even realize how impacted they are by the work until they leave the work. And it's even then, it can be like 6 months to realize the impact. So along those lines, Jenny, because what you talked about was that there is a huge piece of self-reflection and self-awareness in this, that, you know, how do we help equip people to be able to do that kind of self-awareness, you know, self-reflection? Because if you weren't doing it before COVID, pre-COVID, it's kind of like we've just added, oh, I don't know how many layers of stuff, and it's kind of like, who knows what the straw that could break the camel's back. So I'm curious from each of you about how do we equip people to be able to self-reflect and be more in touch with what's going on with them. And Françoise, I'll let you start. I could tell Françoise is really wanting to get
in. Yeah, you can still hear me. I know, I'm very excited about this. So as you know, Karen, I certainly have heard that question many times, and I'm sure Ginny and Cambria have as well. And I think there's two parts to what you were saying. The first part, you were saying, people kind of saying, is this going to create an epidemic? Are we, by raising the notion of secondary trauma, are we giving it to people? And I understand that question, and certainly what we have found in our research is that, yes, when we start talking about it, sometimes it does create a slight spike afterwards because people are self-identifying and recognizing things they already had. We're not giving people secondary trauma, just like it has been proven that in the literature that educating people about suicide and depression does not cause suicide or depression, right? People just become aware of things that were already there. So what I'm excited about, though, is kind of addressing your second point and your second question. I have seen so many people feel that what they thought we were saying is we're going to have yet another layer of effort to stay well. And that's not at all what the literature shows, right? So my wonderful colleague Diana Tickes, who's an expert in neuroscience, has a whole series of tools. In fact, we're sharing some of them in the resources. They're very quick to rapidly reset. And as we know from basic neurophysiology, what works is small and often. So these are not things that you have to add. It's not like saying to people, you know, you have to exercise an hour a day, and people are like, forget about it. These are very small activities that you can do. You know, we talk in neuroscience about train your brain to be here. So you're washing your hands. While you're washing your hands, which we, you know, are doing all the time, it's not about, it's trying to pause and not necessarily think about the next thing you have to do or the thing you just finished. It's just being in that moment. These are micro movements. We also call them nano strategies that you can embed into every element of your day. I mean, I'm doing it right now, right? So I complained before we started that my whole cortisol was elevated because you couldn't hear me, and I was all, but I can still feel the chair on my back and be back here. So they're really small activities that are about pausing and resetting, and they become learned habits, just like, I'm sure if any of you have had to take medication or a vitamin at a certain time of the day, you often associate it with something else. Like you know, my partner puts his pills next to his coffee pot. So in the morning, it's like take the pill, make the coffee. They become linked. So these are activities you can actually link. I finish a file, I do a 30-second pause. I do something else. So they're really actually really easily embedded. They're not just yet one more thing. I just wanted to speak to that.
Yeah, I love that. And some of those things are included in the resource guide, folks, that we'll be posting at the end of the webinar. And one of them is a conversation that we had with Diana Tickes a few months ago that's available on the SRCAC YouTube channel. And it is, I just love how Diana approaches things from just these little tiny things that we do that can make a huge impact. And there's not a single one of them that costs money, by the way. You know, so I love that idea. Cambria or Jenny, do y'all have anything to add to that?
In terms of thinking about that self-reflection piece, that finding that time, I think we often kind of put that off and think, oh, I'm going to stay in the moment, I'm going to stay in the moment, I don't have time to think about how this is impacting me. But I think that's so critical. And as you were telling, you know, kind of your experience with that with people retiring, I was remembering back, I was in a meeting in LA several years ago, and I remember this child welfare administrator who, you know, kind of stood up and said very clearly, Like, I didn't deal with any of this when I was on the job, and now I'm retired, and I realized what a mistake that was, because now it's really haunting me, right? And that has always really stuck with me, that, you know, you do need to find those times in the moment to kind of check in with yourself and say, how am I doing? You know, what is my body feeling? Does my cortisol level feel like it's spiking? And then I think putting into play those micro practices, as Françoise so nicely described, is really important. We have to kind of have that sense of being in touch with ourselves and realizing, you know, what is going on for me, both I think in the very short term, but also kind of reflecting on longer term impacts that it's having on us. So how am I doing today? How have I been doing this week? I think, Françoise, you've shared before, like a daily check-in, you know, kind of idea that you do where you're like, okay, what takes my pulse? Where am I at today? So that idea of kind of checking in frequently.
Right. We got a little blurred there, Cambria, but thank you for that. I think you're exactly right. Jenny, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I wanted to also say that, you know, I'm like the others have heard people say that, more so in the past than currently. You know, some of that stigma has started to dissipate just a little bit. But I also wanted to say that I think people begin to change their mind about this when they realize that we're human beings who are biologically wired for survival. And so when we are feeling unsafe in our environment, either because there's the threat of COVID, because I'm being psychologically disoriented and distressed because of what I'm hearing and seeing, then it is our body's natural response to respond to that. You know, we fight, flight, we freeze, and we move in and out of the window of tolerance based on how often we're being exposed, how extreme those exposures are, and what kind of emotional and psychological resources we have at the time. So when I hear somebody say, you know, I have none of these reactions, I've never had any of these reactions, maybe that's true. Maybe they have this whole cadre of skills to use, but it's also quite possible that what they're having is more of a hypoarousal response, where they're staying in more of a withdrawn, avoidant kind of place because that's their coping style. There's nothing wrong with that. That is natural. That's who we are. And so I just always try to remember that behavior has a function. And if someone is very much in denial about secondary traumatic stress, it could be that they haven't been affected, but it could also be that they just don't understand how they're being affected. And just accept ourselves. We need to accept and be okay with whatever our bodies do, and know that we can get back inside the window if we do the right things. Many of the things that Françoise were mentioning were those things that pull us back inside the window of tolerance.
Yes, and at our international symposium a couple of years ago, Diana Tickus talked about that window of tolerance work. And so I'm going to, somebody like to explain that concept just a little bit. Françoise, I know, you know, Diana's done a lot of work with Penned Academy around this. You want to talk a little bit about this, because I had a real aha moment that I want us to kind of talk about a little bit.
Sure. So originally, I believe it was developed by Dan Siegel, correct, Ginny? I think it was Dan Siegel that started, and then Pat Ogden, who does somatic experiencing, really elaborated it. I actually first became acquainted with the window of tolerance in Claremont, California. I went to a training by Elaine Miller-Karras. And Elaine Miller-Karras is a woman who is a social worker, and she does work in refugee camps. And what she had developed is a community resiliency initiative. So she actually teaches refugees through an interpreter the window of tolerance, and she actually has it in a little notebook, like just a little like plasticized little notebook, and it crosses all international boundaries. It's amazing. So really simply put, the way, and I know Siegel was far more sophisticated, but for me the aha moment was understanding this. So we all have a window. We all have a window. We kind of call it the sweet spot or the zone, and I think we all know when we're in our window. Things are well, we have a sense of flow, we're well focused, you know, what have you. There are times, of course, we're going to have, and some of us have a wider window than others for reasons I'll return to in a minute. For various life events will happen where we will go into either a state of hyperarousal, which I think most of us are familiar with, kind of what happened to me before this webinar. I was frustrated, I was irritated. It might happen if you're on the freeway and someone cuts you off, or someone spills, milk in your fridge and you rip the door off the fridge because you flip your lid, as Diana says. I don't think we talk nearly enough about hypoarousal, and I really am glad Ginny brought that up, because hypoarousal is much more of a freeze state where we are, much more avoidant or paralyzed, or sometimes the folks we work with, a good example, I use the window for so many things now, understanding, in our field, thankfully we're stopped using so often damaging or judgmental language, but we talked about non-compliant patients or clients, sabotaging, people who didn't show up. Often what's happening is those folks are actually in a hypoarousal. So the analogy I often give is, milk has been spilled all over your fridge. Hyperarousal is you rip the door, as I said before, and hypo would be you lie in the puddle of milk in the middle of your kitchen and you surrender. So the thing that's also really interesting about it is, first of all, recognizing that we will have ups and downs, and as I said before, sometimes it's very protective. If I'm on the freeway and it's a very dangerous drive, it's actually a really good idea to be in hyperarousal in that moment to keep me alive. But it's about how quickly we return to baseline. The final thing that's really interesting about the window is not only it can be widened through various practices. Personally, sleep and exercise dramatically widens my window. For some people, eating at regular, times so they're not hangry, what have you. The final piece that's really interesting is some people naturally have a narrower window. So my husband and my daughter have severe attention deficit disorder. They both have severe ADHD, and they have very low frustration tolerance. And we know, and we openly talk about this in our household, that their window to being on hold or being, let's say you're put on hold on a 1-800 call, they have this short a wick, and I have this much of a wick actually. And the final part is recognizing that the people we serve, and often ourselves, if we have 4 or more ACEs, adverse childhood experiences ourselves, and we grew up in an environment of toxic stress, we often start out with a far narrower window. And so that often, to me, explains and allows me to have more empathy for the people that I serve, to be like, oh, right, you went bananas over this because your window's this small. So that's kind of in a nutshell my version of the window of tolerance. And I agree with you, Karen. It changed everything for me, everything.
Yeah, and I think what we see sometimes, and I wonder if this is not part of why folks aren't aware, is that we get stuck in the hyper-aroused or the hypo-aroused. And so it was, in the conversations that it sparked for me when I'm working with folks, is that hypo-aroused. I thought about how many times are folks doing things like going home and getting in their favorite chair and remote in hand and binge watching The Crown. That might be what I'm doing now. Or, staying up all hours playing video, playing games on their phones. And we think that's recharging, but really it's the hypoarousal. And so when I've worked with folks, we talk about how do you know the difference between that checked out, hypoaroused, I'm avoiding, and I'm actually recharging. And I don't know the answer to that question, but I'm really curious to hear how the three of you would answer that question. What's the difference between checked out, avoidant, hypoaroused, and recharging? Ginny?
Well, it really has a lot to do with your level of functioning. The hypoarousal state is a natural response, but it's not a functional response to stay in that state for long term. Somebody who is really shut down, avoidant, is probably the person that's having somatic complaints or is having, problems in relationships, or is, calling in sick to work. Those are the ways that type of hypoarousal can manifest. And so if, you're not a person that's having any functional impairment because of that, so maybe you slip into that state and you have the skills to pull yourself back into the window of tolerance, then, you're doing okay. And maybe that binge watching The Crown was just what you needed. But if you're staying there for a prolonged period of time and it's causing functional impairment, then it's really not working for you in the way that our adaptive.
Oh, that's great. I think one of the things I've just been aware of is to just name it when I'm doing it, just that awareness. But Cambria, what about you?
I think what Ginny had said, and I would add, how do you feel afterwards? So if you are sitting there and binge watching and afterwards you feel recharged and you can, continue on and you've got energy and, focus and motivation again, then that's a good thing, right? But if you do that and then you're like, I just need more, right? That's all I want to do is binge watch and I don't want to get back into things and I don't have the motivation, then that's a sure sign. Again, that functional impairment piece, that's really where you're at. So I think it's really, again, taking your pulse and your temperature with how you're doing, and it maybe you may have an off day, and that's okay. We all have off days where we just need to be mellow and not talk to anybody, and that's our way of recharging. But you need to know if that's working for you, right? So again, it's that constant kind of self-assessment.
Yeah. Françoise, do you have anything to add? Right. Yes, and I think you're right, Cambria. For me, when I'm talking with folks about this, that is, it's kind of like when you exercise and you really hate to exercise and you don't want to go, but you just get up and go do it, and afterwards you're thinking, oh my gosh, this felt so good. I don't know why I don't do this more often. So yeah, I think that's a great thing. I want to shift a little bit now to a question about, we have a question in the chat box about in creating a compassionate culture, would you include staff in developing what that would look like? And I think one of the things that's a real struggle for folks is for leaders who are continually having to shift and continually having to make decisions. And like you talked about, Cambria, I've got a staff member who can't come in, who can't work because they're at such high risk for exposure. But if they stay home and work from home, who's going to pick up some of that slack in the office? And so I guess just talk a little bit about, so how do you go about building a compassionate culture?
That's the $1,000,000 question, isn't it? I think we're still learning a lot about that. But I think one point that I would make is, yes, I think that it's something that you can work on together as a team. But as a leader, you have to go into it with a game plan, right, and kind of know how you're going to address that and have a plan for what you're going to do with it. Because if you just go in and you say, okay, let's just talk about everything, you're probably going to walk into some minefields. Because I think what we're learning through all of this is there's a lot going on in people's personal lives that's impacting how they're handling and how they're reacting to what's going on, and we don't always know what all of those things are, right? So I think having, some kind of thought process, checking in with staff maybe individually first, and getting a little bit better sense for yourself about where folks are coming from, and then using that to kind of have some of that discussion. I would be interested, I know, Ginny, you and I have talked a little bit about what that's been like as you've had staff coming back into the office, and I'd be interested to hear a little bit of your take on
that. Well, Joseph Duran wrote something about the cooperative culture. And so I would say, first of all, a compassionate culture is a cooperative culture. And, one of the things he talks about is that the best ideas kind of come spontaneously from all parts of the organization. And that if you want to build compassion, that you have to have a culture where people feel like they're part of the solution. They're part of building the plane while you're flying it. And so I know, like, one of the things that we do is, we select people from all different ranks and aspects, different programs, and we ask them to come together to solve some of our big problems, like our Safe at Work protocol. Like, what are we going to do, guys? We're all in this together. Let's develop this together. I think this might go to Felipe's question around, would you include staff in developing what this compassionate culture would look like? Absolutely, because compassion and cooperation look different depending on where you're standing in that organization. So I think this is why if you look at some of the organizational assessment tools, they really do promote that people from all aspects of the organization are answering the questions, because it looks very different if you're standing on the front line than if you're sitting in the C-suite. And so we have to make sure that all of those perspectives are heard. So yes, Felipe, I would definitely, want to include staff.
Françoise, do you have anything to add? Because I see you writing.
Oh, yes, I know. I'm jumping in my seat. I have several things to add. Karen, you and I had a wonderful conversation at the very beginning of the pandemic. And one of the things we talked about is that we had realized a lot of leaders tend to naturally be kind of in a fight mode when there is a crisis, and that not necessarily assuming that our folks or our staff are necessarily in fight mode or were in fight mode. And one of the things that we've seen, because we've worked with so many organizations in the last 8 months, is that disconnect between some people being like, let all hands on deck, let's crush this thing, let's work 18 hours a day. And some of you, if you've read my article, This is a Marathon, Not a Sprint, I was really addressing my concern about wear and tear. And I was really addressing my concern about, I guess I should give some context that I worked as a civilian in the military for 10 years. And so I have a lot of experience working with very senior leaders, commanders of missions, 1 to 2 year missions. And when the pandemic hit, some of my colleagues who are still or, formerly in the military contacted me and they said, y'all civilians are just like, first of all, you're not delving into the treasure trove of knowledge we have. Like, we know how to do tours of duty, and we know that people need breaks every 3 months and so on and so forth. And so they were really kind of puzzled at the fact that, I'm not including any, I'm sure maybe some of you got in touch with military expertise, but my country didn't seem to be thinking we have this vast amount of experience available. So kind of really acknowledging wear and tear. And, your different personality styles. And the other piece is that some efforts are, I was thinking of what Cambria was saying earlier, there are some efforts that are much more spray and pray. And I'm not disparaging leadership's willingness and real true desire. But unless, as Ginny and Cambria both said, there's been a proper audit and everyone at every level or people, representatives from each level have been consulted, it can really fall flat. So can I give you a really quick example of a success story that doesn't necessarily replicate? Because I think that'd be interesting. So we're working with a community college right now. They're a very large community college in Toronto. They have over 90,000 part-time students. So very big, very all remote right now, rapid pivot, the whole thing. They started an organic kind of grassroots movement called Fridays at 4. And it really started, we just interviewed the Dean of Students actually yesterday. It just started because one person said, listen, I have a home brewery and I'm going to Zoom from my garage on Friday at 4. Everyone who wants to join me, I'm just going to show you how I make beer. The next week someone said, I play music, and it has gone on for months. And people, and actually the president of the college attends every time. But the thing about it is why it's been so successful is it was organic. It wasn't like, a higher level person saying that, because I think that could really backfire for an organization where people say, we're going to have fun together, forced fun on Zoom. And some people are like, at 4 o'clock on a Friday, quite frankly, that is not what I wish to do. So it's not about just simply copy and pasting someone else's idea. It's kind of looking at how they come, who was involved, what are the grassroots movements. The last piece I want to mention is if any of you are looking for wonderful resources that are free, the Harvard Business School has been producing, Cambria and I have been sharing those resources, have been producing phenomenal resources on compassionate leadership during the pandemic. And they have a whole article on the remote work edition, the importance of perceptions of fairness. how whatever policy you have should actually be offered to all, regardless of their caregiver duties or roles, because I really think perceptions of fairness is actually incredibly important. It was always important, but even more than ever before.
That's great, and we do have links to those articles on the resource page that we'll be posting. So thanks for sending those, Cambria. Yeah, and you know, one of the things that, it's so funny that you mentioned the military, Françoise, because my husband and I were having this conversation this morning. He's a contractor for the Army, and they're having to make some tough decisions right now around, you know, teleworking, not teleworking, and they've just, our numbers are really high right now in Huntsville. In fact, there's like a 20 to 30 positive test rate, which is really high. And so he said, but, you know, in the military, even when people are deployed, we know how important it is for them to have meaningful work to do and a routine and a schedule. And I said, well, Françoise and I have talked about this too, around lessons learned from that. Not only that, but there's a whole process to the deployment piece, you know, which provides a natural way to transition into that. And part of what's missing for us in the COVID stuff, and it impacts all of this, is that all of this happens so fast. I know the leadership at the National Children's Advocacy Center, we met on one Friday to talk about what our plan was going to be for Monday, and this is, you know, mid-March. And we also, when we left the meeting, said, what are the things that will bring us back together over the weekend if these things happen? Well, by 5 o'clock on Friday, those things had happened. And one of the things we were consciously aware of was, number one, we really do have a culture of participatory decision-making, but we didn't have time for that in this. It was kind of like, you don't have time to sit down and discuss for an hour how we're going to send everybody home, you know, and how are we going to get everybody up and running and, you know, able to VPN and all of those kinds of things. And so I do think we lost some of that, and I wonder if we haven't really come back to that yet. And because it's so much harder to have those kinds of conversations virtually versus if we were all in a room together, that could feel a lot more comfortable, you know. And then I also saw that because we didn't think this was going to go on for 9 months, I saw that there were some CACs that sent people home for a couple of weeks, and there wasn't this clear expectation of you're to be working 8 hours a day. You know, we're thinking this is going to last a week or two, do what you can, but it's okay. And I really saw some of those folks that had that was their perspective, that those staff members were struggling, you know, 2 months into it. And so I do think that we're talking about in our world about it almost feels like there's going to have to be some sort of reset, that we know our MDTs are struggling in those relationships, but even with our staff, you know, so some of those things that went by the wayside in just the urgency of COVID and how we went about it, we skipped lots of steps. So how do we, you know, how do leaders go about anticipating, setting up for, setting the frame for, because vaccines are on the horizon, how do we go about setting up the, you know, the setting the stage for a reset and for groups to really come back together? It's one of the best things about the CAC world is that people find so much support from their colleagues, and you know that's been eroded, and we haven't been able to draw on that during the pandemic as well. So anybody have any ideas around that? How do we go about resetting and getting back to some of those things that we were probably doing pre-COVID?
Well, you know, I could say a few things about that. I think maybe it's not even resetting, maybe it's refining, because, you know, I think what we've done a lot of work over the years, I know in my center, to really put a lot of healthy protocols in place for people. And so, you know, I would say pretty much everybody here has, you know, a plan on what they do when they feel overwhelmed. They have some really good self-regulation tools, and they have good ways to access peer support. Then here comes COVID, right? And no longer can you grab your buddy and go for a walk at lunch when you need to kind of take a minute and process something that's happened. That reflective supervision that you established and that has been working so well now is done by Zoom, and it's interrupted with barking dogs and children coming to say, help me with my homework, and you know, frozen screens. And, you know, all of those things that we put in place to help us cope and to kind of get through and be productive and healthy at work, it's all changed. And it doesn't mean that it's gone, but we have to figure out a different way to get those supports and to have that kind of connection. So like, for example, I have my go-to people here. You know, we touch base together, we kind of lean on each other. And now what happens is I think, oh, I really need to talk to so-and-so, but maybe they're busy, and let me look and see, I need to schedule something. I have 30 minutes on Friday, but I don't dare reach out and schedule that because by Friday I'm going to need that 30 minutes to catch up. And so I let it go. And so I have to like instinctually say, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to reach out to my friend, and I'm going to make time to have this conversation via Zoom and just process what's happening, even though it feels like too much. I've got to do it. And we have to, like, we do now huddles now. For each program, I have my program coordinators. We gather the whole team together. We do self-care for the first 5 to 10 minutes of every meeting, because we all need that moment, right? We need that little, like, break to stop, center, feel ourselves in the chair, like Françoise said, get in touch with our breathing. And it's now like something people are replicating. It's like, I don't have to be there for you guys to do this. If you're having a meeting with 3 people, start with the self-care moment. So it's like finding these workarounds, these other ways to do it, which maybe wasn't what we did before, but it's like we're fighting for our lives here. And so we're going to keep doing this no matter what we have to do to make it happen. I
think it's
like
that intention, right?
And committing to it.
Cambria, Françoise, do you have anything to add before I read some great things that are coming up in the chat here?
Say one thing, you know, to keep in mind based on what you had talked about in the beginning, that everything happened so quickly and decisions had to be made very quickly and people weren't able to be involved, is to really be conscious of that as you go back into kind of looking at what's the next step and how do you slow that process down a little bit. You know, the reality is, yes, there was a rush to get everybody into places where they could be safe and operating and figuring out how to continue operations, but there doesn't necessarily need to be a rush the other direction, right? And so thinking that through a little bit more and thinking about how do we look at that. And I would say go back, like one of the things that I've noticed is that all of that happened and then it was like, okay, keep going. And there hasn't been a lot of like, can we talk about how that process worked, right? Can we get some feedback about what's working and what isn't about how we did that in the first place? So I think almost going back to that and saying, you know, let's talk about what did happen, and then let's talk about lessons learned from that, and then how we bring that back as we look at transitioning, you know, as the vaccines come out and people transition back in. I think it's going to be really interesting, too, to see what people's comfort level is. And I've thought about this for myself, just like, what's it going to feel like to see somebody and, like, be in the same room as them and not necessarily have to be 6 feet apart or wearing a mask at some point. Like, that's going to feel odd after all of this, right? And so I think we have to have some kind of understand that people's comfort level with that those types of connection are going to be different, and how do we kind of plan for that and create, not necessarily the physical safety, although that's really key and important, but once the physical safety piece is more apparent of what we need to do, how do we create the psychological safety for people to share how they're feeling about this and whether they're feeling safe or not?
That's a great point. Françoise?
Yeah. I have so many thoughts about this. So I'm a student of history. I have my undergrad was actually in history, and I was really interested in demographics, urban demographics, and the Second World War, how it affected civilians, all of that. And that's really been coming back to me because, there is no new normal. Like, that's not what's happening. And in fact, any of you who remember these beautiful time or life photographs, there's this iconic photograph of the day that, the Second World War had ended and everyone's kissing in the streets, and everyone knows that photograph. And in fact, if you've ever been to Pearl Harbor, I think it's in Pearl Harbor, there's that iconic statue of that, or whatever, sailor kissing person, all of that. But that's actually not what happened, right? And what happened is that the war didn't just go from 1939 to 1945. There were many, many years of displaced individuals. There were many years of incredible, there was a wonderful New Yorker article a couple of weeks ago about the journey of displaced persons, after the war, all of that. And I'm not actually saying that to be pessimistic, quite on the contrary. To go back to what you were saying, Karen, I think that this is largely about also managing our own expectations. So I used to be a long-distance runner before I got injured. And as a long-distance runner, if you had said to me, there's no, like if you'd said to me in the first 5 or 6 miles, there's no more water until the end, I would have crashed. I wouldn't have actually been able to finish, because psychologically all of a sudden there's like, well, I can't do that. So I think that this is also about managing expectations. People, and I'm not judging, but people who dealt with this as if it was a hurricane and you're just going to hunker down for a week until it passes, are people, I think, and the data will tell us, it's going to be really interesting to see, how people manage their own psyche around this, as opposed to people who said this is going to last 18 months. I think that revising and managing our expectations are really important. So if I can add one really quick piece, I was just on a Zoom call. Okay, I was listening to a Zoom webinar. It's going to sound like I was on a Zoom call with Dr. Fauci. I was not. I was just watching a Zoom webinar from the Hastings Center, on moral distress. And Dr. Fauci was the guest, and he was just a half an hour ago, it's going to be recorded, he was talking about the rollout of the vaccine, and he said, he wanted to manage expectation and say, until X% of the population has been immunized, we're all going to have to still do all the things we're doing right now, of course. So I think it's important right now to also manage that expectation. 95% effectiveness is amazing, but this isn't about somehow, it's just like the Second World War. There won't be people kissing in the streets. That's not how it's going to go. And if we adjust, that'd be lovely, though. I would be totally down for that. But if we can actually psychologically adjust to that, I think it really helps us managing our own energy and our own sense of, loss and grief and, kind of pining for things that are no longer.
Yeah, I think those are excellent points, everybody. And the kind of the theme I'm hearing is intentionality. We have to be intentional about how we're going to, even identifying the discussions that need to be had, and then how we're going to have those discussions. One of the things that I think it's really time for us to start thinking about, and somebody put it here in the chat, Connie Billups, we already decided that a lot of things will remain the same, like statewide meetings with Zoom, even when COVID is over. So yeah, there are some real adjustments that we made and made quickly, like telemental health. We had been, in the CAC world, we had been talking nationally about that. The Western Regional CAC was doing a lot of work around that. People were real kind of resistant or slow to take that up until COVID hit. And now all of a sudden there's been this major shift to telemental health. That's probably something we're going to want to keep. But what are some of those other adjustments or accommodations that we've made that may not have served us as well that we need to have conversation around. And that seems to me like possibly a good framework for what you were talking about, Cambria, around, you know, yeah, just we made these shifts quickly, but we can go back and process and have some conversations about what really worked for us and what didn't, and at what cost maybe. And so I think that's great. And I'm hearing lots of good suggestions. Marcia Main said our agency director has encouraged us to make time daily and do a gratitude journal and think about 3 positive things about our day before going to bed. Somebody else is reminding employees to still reach out, that it's a challenge, but we need to keep pushing people to do it. I was in a conversation or a meeting with Char Rivette, who's the CEO of the Chicago CAC, and they're intentionally, and even before COVID, doing some real work around organizational staff wellness. They're now starting every single meeting that happens at the Chicago CAC with something like the 3-minute breathing card. I had it written down, but that 3-minute breathing, and it's in the resources guide that you guys can look at, because they're just, it is literally a couple of minutes that they're doing some breathing together, and they're doing just a little bit of body scan, and it's not taking a lot of time, but it's part of that, I think, compassionate culture. Realizing that our minds are in 15 different directions, and we can do small things and prioritize some of these actions that are micro practices into the very culture and operations of our organizations. Okay, I have another question. Yes, sure.
Karen, could I? Oh, I just wanted to, you know, just affirm Marcia's organization that's really focusing on gratitude, because I do think that's a piece we miss. This is a very difficult time, but there are some good things that are happening. I think having a little balance in our perspective is a healthy practice, and this whole idea about gratitude, I think, is very important. You know, the saying goes that we don't have gratitude because we're happy. We're happy because we have gratitude. And it's something that has to be cultivated. So there is this great app. I don't know if anybody else uses it, but I personally use it. It's called the Gratefulness app. And it's just like an online journal that you go on your phone. And what I like about it, you can put anything in there. Nobody sees it but you. And if you don't remember to enter something, it will email you and say, hey, what are you grateful for today? Which is a really nice reminder, you know, to like stop and shift perspective. I think just that act of getting that email saying, hey, what are you grateful for today, is a moment of mindfulness where you can stop and think about that. It really does shift perspective. And so I think
I love
Marcia,
that, and Melissa Brunner from our team has put in, you can upload pictures in it to remember what you're grateful for. And I was reading something the other day about some of these things that, you know, are successes for us, that raise our compassion satisfaction if we have tokens or visual reminders of those. And so I love that idea of having those pictures there to help you. And am I correct? Doesn't the research say that even if you don't identify something that you're grateful for, just asking the question helps in and of itself, even without naming what you're grateful for? Yeah. Yeah, amazing stuff. Okay, we only have just 13 more minutes. So I encourage you guys, if you have any lingering questions, but here's a question that I have for you guys. Have you read anything, a book, an article that has just kind of rocked your world that you think everybody needs to read about?
I can go first.
Sure.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. You can hear me now? Sorry, I just lost Ginny for a while, so I was nervous. So the two things I found game-changing were very short, and they were written by the same author. Her name is Professor Aisha Ahmad, and it's A-H-M-A-D, Aisha, and she's a professor at the Monk School here in Toronto. And she has years of experience working in armed conflict situations. And at the beginning of the pandemic, she wrote an article called something like "All That Productivity Talk Is Not," like basically is harmful, or she's like basically all of you academics who are saying the pandemic is going to be the time to write your great American novel, let me dissuade you, or actually, you know, burst your bubble, because she's lived through armed conflict before, and she said it also was setting up an incredible unfair expectation. And this, she wrote this at the very beginning, end of March. And it, literally, if you Google Ahmad and all that productivity pressure, it comes up. And I find it so helpful for her to say, hang on, this is not how we experience this. And then she talks a bit about the neurophysiology. The second offering is she wrote this beautiful article at the end of August, and it's called The 6-Month Wall. And I was finding that a lot of folks, I was working with quite a few CACs, and end of August, people were exhausted. Everyone was just, we all looked, you know, gray and worn out, and a lot of kids were going back to school in some states and the stress around that. And she wrote about that. It's almost like she just knows, right? And she wrote about the 6-month wall and how normal it is, but how it also passes. And I love her languaging because her texts are all, they're very normalizing and validating. And I found both of those articles to be real game changers for me anyways.
I pulled some stuff from that article, the wall, hitting the wall at 6 months, for a presentation I did earlier this week, Françoise. And Cambria, did you include those? Because I noticed there were some articles on productivity that you had sent as a part of the resources.
I don't remember.
Was that them, or maybe not?
The COVID fog. I did send some, but I don't know if it was that particular one.
Exactly, the COVID. Yeah. And don't you love when I ask the questions that I haven't prepared you for, which, by the way, I think I've only asked one question that was from the list I sent you guys for us to talk about. So anybody else, a book or article that you think just must read?
Well, you know, I could share that there is a book by Amy Edmondson. It's called The Fearless Organization. And I was definitely drawn to this because one of the things that I have learned in this whole thing is the need for courage, both as a leader, courage as an organization, courage to keep moving forward and to keep finding new ways of being innovative in this very difficult circumstance, courage not to give in to the fear and panic that, you know, this circumstance has kind of layered on top of everything else that we deal with. And there is a chapter in this book, it's called Dangerous Silence. And it really gets at, you know, how dangerous it really is to not act when you feel compelled to do so, or to let fear stand between you and this innovation. And so I have felt this kind of gravitational pull sometimes away from action and maybe just keeping this whole mindset of status quo. Just try to keep things afloat. Just try to keep everybody safe. But that's really not what we're called on to do when we're in crisis. You know, what we're called on to do is to thrive. And I am over this whole just surviving thing, but it takes a lot of courage to say I'm going to shift into thriving mode. And so I felt like this book was just what I needed to read.
I think for me, one of the things that I listened to very kind of early on in all of this was a podcast that Brene Brown did on comparative suffering. And that was really, really helpful for me because I was having some of this guilt that like, well, but I have all these things to be grateful for, and there's all these other people out there who are in these really difficult circumstances. And it was very helpful for me to listen to kind of what she had to say on that, and the fact that, you know, me feeling that way wasn't helping anybody, right? And kind of really looking into, you know, what was that about for me, and how do I acknowledge that, like, there are challenges that I'm having, and they're different than the challenges that other people are having. But that sitting there and comparing it like that was not, you know, a helpful thing to do. So I think for me that was really telling. The other thing that I will share, this I keep near my desk here. I don't know how well you can read it, but my son wrote this to me. It says, "To Mom, I love you the best I can," from Colvin, right? And I had this kind of realization that that's what things are about right now, right? It's doing everything just the best that you can, and that's okay. Like, we're not going to be at 100%. But doing things the best we can is so critical.
Oh, I think that is such a great reminder, Cambria. I did a webinar last week, a couple of weeks ago, with Susan Kennedy from NCMEC, and as we were just preparing for the webinar, she said, you know, none of us are the parents or the professionals that we want to be right now. And I thought that was so profound because it's what you said. We're doing the best that we can, juggling things that we've never thought we had to juggle before with very little preparation. My favorite read right now, and we did a podcast with Tim last week, is Hope Rising, How the Science of Hope Can Change Your Life. It's the work of Chan Hellman. I just can't wait to get him involved sometimes with some of our discussions. Because it was just, he did just bring a whole different lens of some of the work that we're doing. So I really liked his work. Okay, we have a question in the chat box. Is this our Brian Miller, our CSERT Brian Miller? But the question is, I seem to have two modes. One is to deal with this as a hurricane, time limited, and one is this is the new normal that must be adjusted to. Based on what Françoise was saying, how do you guys define how we define this new circumstance? Ooh.
Do you want me to go first?
I do.
Linda Duxbury, D-U-X-B-U-R-Y. Linda Duxbury is a Canadian thinker on organizational health. And she's actually collecting a lot of data right now about role conflict during the pandemic, which is really powerful. And she gave a talk a couple of weeks ago. And she said, this is a moment of, for us, this current generation, of unprecedented disruption. She said, this is not the new normal. It's not a short time limited thing. And in a way, she was kind of saying, you know, buckle up, that we have more things coming. And again, I'm not saying that to discourage people. It's you know, we're having to deal with climate change. We're going to have to deal. She said this is actually a really good dress rehearsal for disruptions to come. You know, things are really elevated. We all know that, regardless of what country we live in right now. And she says this is a really good opportunity for us to really assess, not try and do things the way they used to be. We're also looking at big demographic changes. You know, the boomers are almost all leaving or gone from the work environment. Gen Z's coming up. These are disrupted times, and I think that neither of those models are necessarily working for us right now, and we need to find a new one. If this is really our Brian Miller, first of all, I send him lots of love, and he is such a wordsmith that I firmly believe he will come up with a proper word for this thing we're in, maelstrom, perhaps. Those are my thoughts.
Great. Anybody else?
So looking at what we learned from this circumstances is part of our new normal. So there are things that, like,
all right,
you know, as much as they're difficult and they're frustrating, that I think if you can reframe some of those things and really realize, gosh, you know, I know so much more than I knew before. Like for me, I'm having to do a lot more with my kids around school. And I had this realization yesterday. I was like, wait, I suddenly have a much better picture of like how they learn. And and what the struggles are for them. And gosh, isn't that going to be helpful in the future when they're back in the brick and mortar school and I don't have that window, right? So I think some of what we have to kind of look at some of those bright moments and some of those reframes about what are we taking from this, just like you said before in terms of doing things remotely versus not remotely and all of that. So I think learning some of those and being able to pull those in, and maybe we don't get back to the new normal, but maybe we get to a better place.
I love that, Cambria. Well, guys, we could talk forever, I think, and it's been just a pure pleasure to be able to have this conversation with you guys. I hope all the participants have had as much fun as I have. So thank you so much for doing this, and I look forward to when we get to meet in person and have these conversations in person. So Laura, I will hand it back to you.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you to our presenters, and thank you to our participants who've been here with us today. We are going to share with you